Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hood Museum of Art. My name is John Stomberg. I'm the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S director here. And it is truly my pleasure to welcome you to what is going to be a fantastic program this afternoon. As always, we'd like to start by acknowledging that Dartmouth and the Hood Museum are located on lands that were once populated by the Abenaki, and they have never been ceded to us. And this little reminder is something that we do on a regular basis, not so much like uttering a prayer, but more to keep us in mind of where we are, so that we remember the people who called these ancestral lands home and still do. And so it's important for us to bring this up whenever we gather together, so that we're reminded of the histories that brought us to this day and the sacrifices that have been made to get us here. So with that, I would like to also say that I'm not going to be up here for very long. Good news. Our wonderful Associate Curator of American Art, Michael Hartman, will be here in just a moment to kick things off and introduce the panelists, but I have the pleasure of saying thank you to a few individuals and foundations who have made this possible. First, we want to thank the Smithsonian for letting us participate in this fantastic exhibition. From the moment we heard about this show, we were excited, and we said, oh, we'd really love to have this. And it took us a while to get there, but it's here, we're thrilled. And we then went back and said, could we have it even for a few more weeks? So it's on through commencement. So this has been a really great partnership with the Smithsonian, and may it be the beginning of other partnerships. The Manton Foundation and the Orozco Fund have given us the funds to do this. And that is a fund that supports the Orozco murals care, but care broadly defined to include interpretation, constant lectures, thinking about other art that relates to that. And under that rubric, they were happy to support this exhibition. I think that, frankly, this is a total guess, and maybe the expert in the room would say no, but I think Orozco would probably like this show fairly much. So, nobody here to argue with that one. Anyhow, and I wanted to thank all of you. This is a community-based show, and we're really interested in having our community participate in it. We've had some wonderful lectures and tours throughout the whole time. So we've been thrilled that we've had all of you here with us. Wonderful group of faculty have been using this exhibition in their teaching, and we're very, very happy about that. And we're sure that it will continue to raise interest in this subject on an ongoing basis, because that's really what you want to do. You don't want to just have all this interest for 3 months and then have it disappear. So hopefully, like, this is precedent setting and something that we can keep going. And I'm grateful to all of the speakers who will be introduced properly in a moment. And I just want to point out that we have a wonderful board of advisors here at the Hood, and they're all here today. Thank you very much for all you do, all the support you offer us, and all the different ways that you do support the work that we do. And finally, I just want to thank a couple people on our staff, because Michael Hartman and Beatriz Yanez Martinez have been working really hard on this show. And the show was fully conceived and perfect, but still they had to make it work in our space. And it was a lot of work. And I watched permutations of this that extended out into the campus and up into the heavens. And, it took a while to get where we are. And you walk in those galleries now and you're like, of course this is perfect. But it took some work, and so I really appreciate that, you guys. And then this event wouldn't be possible without our dynamic duo of Sharon and Laura, Sharon Reed and Laura Howard, who seamlessly and seemingly effortlessly pull all this together. They're the people behind the scenes who make sure that all of this happens. So Laura and Sharon, thank you so much for all you do for all of us. And with that, I turn it over to Michael Hartman, the Jonathan Little Cohen Associate Curator of American Art.
Thank you, John. I've written my remarks so that I will remain brief so we can get to the speakers. But it's a delight to welcome all of you here this evening for what I think will be an engaging discussion. Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicanographics, 1965 to now, was curated by E. Carmen Ramos at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And this exhibition's presentation at the Hood Museum really does reflect our dedication to telling a broader, more diverse, and more inclusive history of American art. The artists featured in this exhibition channel their social activism into assertive aesthetic statements, celebrating and uplifting their communities while advocating for real political and social change. Their stories have long been neglected within the primarily white histories of US art, as well as Western art more broadly. And as we here at the Hood are looking at how we collect, what we collect, and who we exhibit, we will continue to embrace more complicated national and international narratives that are more representative of our country's diversity of experiences and identities. The works in this exhibition are just one of the many stories in the history of American art, and we are lucky tonight to have two leading artists and a curator speak about their work within this exhibition and beyond. Each of our panelists this evening will speak individually here for a short amount of time, and then at the end we will have a moderated discussion up front. Before I begin, I just also want to say my thanks to Beatriz Yanez Martinez, who was really my co-collaborator from beginning to end on this project. We laid out the show, we read the labels, read the catalog, figured out where everything goes, and from every moment we were doing things together. And Beatriz, I want to thank you for all of the work that you've done here. So I'll go ahead and kick things off by introducing our first speaker this evening. Dr. Claudia E. Zapata, who uses they, them pronouns, earned their PhD in art history at Southern Methodist University's RASCA, or Rhetorics of Art, Space, and Culture program. They received their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in Maya art from the classic period. Zapata was the curator of exhibitions and programs at the Mexicarte Museum. From 2018 to 2022, Claudia was the curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Currently, they are a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, and their current research analyzes Chicanx and Latinx creators in Web3. In 2023, they will also begin their position as the Blanton Museum of Art's first curator of Latino art. So welcome, Claudia.
Hi, how are you? Thank you all for the invitation. So I was able to work on this project. I started in 2018 as the curatorial assistant. At the time I was working on my dissertation and I saw the call for this exhibition and needed research help with regards to Chicano art and Latino art, and I kind of jumped at that opportunity. And I had one interview with Carmen Ramos over the phone, and she said, okay, how soon can you get here? It was one of these, like, you were quickly on Smithsonian time, and you realized it's getting real. And so the exhibition, when you're working on anything Chicano, it's very challenging because everyone's coming at it from a different angle as to what is even Chicano, or I don't want to talk about Cesar Chavez anymore, or we need to talk about Cesar Chavez more. Everyone has their different angle, and it's an incredibly different task per region, per generation, as to how people are going to access this information, and to even think about the Chicano rights movement and all the encompassing parts to it ranging from labor rights and really Cesar Chavez and Lois Huerta, and that's really how most people know it in terms of a mainstream culture, but also thinking about education rights, thinking about land rights, all across the Southwest. Really, that's the predominant area, but it is a national conversation when you're thinking about labor rights. So it's always a Herculean task when you start that conversation about Chicano graphics, because you get so stuck in the name before you even get to the artwork. And you're like, well, what about the artwork? And you eventually get there. So that was always interesting when we were talking to students, docents, everybody. They were like, well, is it Hispanic art? I'm like, no, let's not start there. So in 1995, Tomás Ibarra Frausto donated several prints to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And Tomás, who's the gentleman standing, and his late partner is seated, Dudley Brooks. It's important to think of them as a collector couple. Oftentimes people just say Tomás, but it's really Tomás and Dudley. They donated several prints to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as well as their archives to the Archives of American Art. So it's one of the most sought after archives, and then in terms of the prints that he donated, that was really the foundation for this exhibition. So Carmen Ramos decided to do a Chicano graphics exhibition, starting with Tomás's collection. And like most endeavors for Carmen Ramos, because she was the first Latino curator, she quickly realized she needed to supplement that collection because it ended really at 1995 upon the donation. And it's very interesting when you talk about Chicano art, because people always say it's dead. That's something I've come across a lot. Chicano art is dead. And it's so interesting because you can see Gen Z and Alpha still using Chicano art. It's a common name, and it's a common identifier that's very much not dead, very much alive, very much active. And so as we were developing the exhibition, we realized that we still needed to supplement the collection. And luckily, we were able to receive several donations from other collector couples. The collector experience for Chicano art is completely different from thinking about mainstream collecting, diversification of financial portfolios, thinking about blue chip artists, that whole experience. Like if you're watching a movie and you see someone like buying art and it's a collector and they're saying, that is a completely different experience from what Chicano collecting is. It is very much about community connections, very much connecting with the artists specifically. They know these artists, they're friends with them, and it's definitely not a financial endeavor. It is purely personal, and it's for this larger activist network of thinking about collecting as this radical act. And the woman in the center who's now deceased, Margie Santos, that's how her family refers to her, it was very interesting because we were developing the exhibition probably late 2018, and we received an email from one of our specialists that was part of the catalog, and they said someone had just emailed them because they had Googled Latino art specialists. And so what we've run into is that several families of late collectors or late artists that are Latino, they're really trying to understand the estate planning situation and really understanding that what do we do with all these things that my deceased family member has collected, and where do we even go? So that was just a cold call. And luckily, through that connection, we were able to receive this major donation from the Santos estate that completely transformed the show and then the collection at Smithsonian American Art Museum. With these collectors, we were able to increase the Latinx collections by 300%. So there's the major shift in what we're identifying as Latinx art, what we're obviously identifying as American art because of Smithsonian American Art Museum's mission, because of these types of collectors and their activist collecting. And what's great about Margie's collection, she's a queer woman from San Francisco. Several more women and queer artists were then added to the collection, which was great. And with this time, usually with Chicano art shows, your challenge is always the budget. I mean, that's for really any project, but so many exhibitions just don't have a large enough budget to recognize the amount of research that needs to go into it, catalogs that need to be produced. We're talking about multi-million-dollar engagement. Most institutions that deal with this artwork, unfortunately, do not have those level of resources. And so there are several institutions, culturally specific institutions, also referred to as ethnically specific cultural arts institutions, that are always doing these types of shows, but unfortunately, they're not recognized in larger historiographies about art history and Chicano art because there's not a catalog. Or they don't have someone that can travel to archives in another state. It's just, there's not as much time. And luckily, with this type of show, we were able to do more research, obviously pre-COVID. So this image I bring up, this is Javier Viramontes. Usually, when people think about Chicano art, it's a very top 10 greatest hits. There's Sun Mad, this one. There's always these couple that are defining the movement. And Javier Viramontes is definitely one of those. And so you're just used to seeing the image, but you're not really used to seeing the image in context. So this was originally in El Malcriado. El Malcriado was the newsletter for the United Farm Workers Movement. So the United Farm Workers Movement had a leg that was basically mail commerce. So you could buy posters, pens, that sort of thing through this leg called El Taller Gráfico. So they also produced prints and things like that to sell in order to help the UFW fundraise. And so to see this print in the back of a newsletter at those really low costs is very interesting because you think the origins of an artwork have this very pristine in the studio kind of feel. And actually, really anybody could access this image, anybody could order this, and it was key to a labor movement and really thinking about the legacy of a print, a legacy of a political print. It just has a different narrative and pathway than thinking about fine art studio prints, which there are both of these kinds in the show. It was very interesting being able to go to like archives, for example, because I was able to go to Detroit and I was able to go to the UFW archives, and that's really where you see the living artist. And Javier Viramontes, you always see that image and you see this very fierce warrior-like figure. And you think of Cesar Chavez, and it has this very emboldened feeling. And then I found this letter which he sent to the UFW offices, basically saying, hey, this print is really good, and I'm not saying that because I made it, but because it's true. So the hubris, which he was right, one of the best-selling prints, and obviously top 10, so he definitely called it on that one. But that sort of extensive research in that time to be able to see the letters between the artists and the Cesar Chavez offices and thinking about the UFW and thinking about he was actually the first artist to actually get a percentage of the sales of the print because he demanded that in this letter. All the other artists that were working with the United Farm Workers, for example, were doing everything for free. There's also It's Simple, Steve, Herbert Sigüenza, and Unidentified Artists. This is another interesting opportunity that this whole exhibition afforded is really understanding Central American artists' role in thinking about Chicano identity. Herbert Sigüenza is from El Salvador. There's this assumption that Chicano identity is purely Mexican-American, which it is more of a political identity, and really thinking about the role of Central American artists in the Bay Area, for example, where everybody was working together and everybody was really thinking about anti-imperialist causes and thinking about the immigration that was happening from Central America and Latin American countries as a result of the US intervention. So thinking about that, we were able to look to these prints and identify the non-Mexican American artists and bring them up versus kind of glossing over their experience, and also highlighting the kind of disruption of making the print. For example, it was very interesting when we were doing the questions with the artists because some of them just didn't even consider their prints artwork. And we would sometimes get very short responses like, yeah, I did that, or something. Very short. They didn't want to have a conversation. Or they're like, that, I don't consider that fine artwork, but yeah, I did that. It was always this kind of push and pull. And Herbert was kind of one of those. Herbert Sigüenza is primarily an actor. He's actually in a Netflix series called Gentefied. He's known for being in the theater troupe Culture Clash, which at one point had a show on Fox. And it was interesting because you would see the older artists use Facebook as this way of promoting their presence in the show, and that would create this discourse online between them. And so what you're seeing is this Facebook conversation that Herbert was having with other artists as a result of him sharing the catalog, the exhibition catalog. And then he started talking about that print that I just showed and how he didn't know the original artist. He colored it, so he modified it. He was a part of that change, and he was part of this final product. But he himself has always felt insecure about identifying as an artist. And in other catalogs, you'll see that he's identified as the sole artist. So these kind of curiosities from Chicano art history then had a little bit more time to be identified and to also think about conjuring up past memories that some of these artists really have not acknowledged for several decades. It's a great case study, this exhibition, because it was the worst time ever to do a curatorial project. If you could survive the making of this project, you can survive anything, basically, at this point. So I'm like, oh, there's not a pandemic and the world's not collapsing. Yeah, sure, let's do the show. So this was interesting being in DC as we were developing the project, because we had the longest government shutdown, we had the pandemic, we had the uprisings, we had January 6th, we had social distancing in museums, we had the whole rethinking of the museum. Now everything had to be digital. Our opening reception for the exhibition had to be digital. We opened the exhibition and it immediately had to be closed down because of COVID restrictions. So that whole schedule was up and down and up and down, and everything had to be adapted to working from home. And at this point, when, for example, this image in the upper left-hand corner, that was after January 6th, before the inauguration, they had created this perimeter of tanks, and I had to go through the perimeter to go to the offices and send out catalogs to artists. So really blood, sweat, and tears, and tanks, and so forth, to really make this happen. And so it's very interesting, and it needs to be studied on its own, in addition to the artwork. But as a result of how much has changed culturally and socially, so many artists have produced their own political graphics relating to all these movements. So at this point, this show is great, but we need a part 2, hopefully. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for those wonderful remarks, Claudia. My name is Beatriz Yanes Martinez. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I am the Board of Advisors Mutual Learning Fellow in the Curatorial Department. And I'm really excited to introduce artist Sonia Romero, who uses she, her pronouns, and she's a fine artist and public artist based in Los Angeles. She received her BFA at the Rhode Island School of Design and specializes in creating multimedia works that combine painting, printing, and paper cutting techniques. She has exhibited her works in solo and group exhibitions across the United States. In addition to producing original paintings, sculpture, and print editions, Romero has also completed more than 15 permanent and temporary large-scale public art commissions in the state of California. This include murals commissioned by Los Angeles County Arts Commission, the Los Angeles Metro at the MacArthur Park Station, and the Community Redevelopment Agency. Please join me in welcoming Sonia Romero.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sonia Romero. I'm from Los Angeles. I am a painter, printmaker, and public artist. I was born directly into the Chicano art world because my parents are both artists. My parents are Frank Romero and Nancy Romero, and I was born surrounded by Chicano art. But myself have never identified that way. However, everybody else identifies me that way. I want to show you a little bit about my public art practice. This is primarily what I've been working on for the last 15 years. So working as a public artist means that you're creating location-based artwork, and usually your client is some sort of government entity, like this one here is the Los Angeles Metro. This is Mariachi Plaza in Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. It's underground, but above ground in Mariachi Plaza is where you go to hire your musicians for your party, and it's a famous location. I was really honored to receive the commission for this station. The theme of the mural is hands holding objects of significance that represent Boyle Heights, or the residents of Boyle Heights. And these projects can sometimes take a really long time. This took 5 years from start to finish, although the actual painting of their mural only took me 1 year. I painted it in panels in my studio, and the reason why it's painted mural is that it's inside, protected, and it's 10 feet off the ground, so it's hard to vandalize. But usually, government entities will not commission painted murals because they're really easy to vandalize. This is another project I recently finished in El Sereno, which is in northeast Los Angeles. It's called El Sereno Serape. This was commissioned by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs. The aim here was to create an artwork that you could see within seconds as you whipped around the corner in your car. I'm sure you know that Los Angeles is a driving city, and this is a public road, so I needed it to be made out of tile so that it was easy to clean from vandalism and could last within the elements. So my idea was to create this serape that you could see just really fast and get the ideas. This was a primarily Latinx neighborhood, like over 90% at the time I started this project, but it is a neighborhood that is facing gentrification. If you are a pedestrian and walking along the street, you will see that within each stripe, I did drawings of the community and the uniqueness of the city of El Sereno. I have over 40 drawings on these tiles, and I like this project a lot because it has 2 different viewpoints, and you might not necessarily know about the drawings unless you walked along. I don't only work in Latinx neighborhoods. This is a project for Little Tokyo, which is in downtown Los Angeles, working with Japanese Americans. And the idea here, I was hired to make neighborhood identification markers so that when you're walking or driving around, you know that you're in Little Tokyo. It's about a city of 5 blocks. It's about 5 blocks in downtown Los Angeles, and there's 40 of these. This is just a quick temporary mural I did for FX and the TV show Mayans, which is a motorcycle gang show. If you ever heard of it. This is just a fun project. I wanted to show you some more of my work. But I'll talk a little bit about B-Pile, which is in the show here at the museum. This is made out of felt. I do mostly linoleum cut printing. I do a lot of kinds of printing, but I often work in linoleum cut. So basically, I carved the bees on a stamp-like material, and I stamped it on felt, and I cut them all out. There's about 9 different bees, or there's several different bees, and a few hundred bees were finally mated into the pile, and they're all sewn by myself. They're stuffed. I want to tell you how I came about doing this pile series. So this was one of the photos that inspired my pile series. I came across this on the internet. It's from the 1890s, and it's from a fertilizer company. At first, when I saw this picture, I was just like visually impacted. I felt like it was visually stunning. I think it's beautiful. I love categorizing things into piles. I just think it's pleasurable. But when you start to think about what it's a picture of, it's horrifying. These are bison skulls. And if you can imagine a 2,000-pound bison connected to each of these, and you see the vastness of the pile, it's just so horrifying, because the American bison was, basically massacred and one of the reasons is to take away a food source and a shelter source and a spirituality source from Native Americans. So this is a bison skull pile, block printing and acrylic on wood panel, and I mixed it with red roses to indicate blood. This is from, I think, 2012. I had a solo show at the Vincent Price Art Museum in East Los Angeles. There are 3 piles I did directly onto the wall like wallpaper. The one on the left is bison skulls. The one on the center is commodity corn, and the one on the other side is eggs. Because around that time, there was a bunch of eggs incinerated because, like millions of them, because of some sort of bacterial infection. They had to get rid of them. And it's like, ironically, nowadays we're having another egg issue. So I think this piece should maybe come back. But I was really interested in learning about farming at the time. I was learning about the difference between organic farms and commercial farms. I actually went up to Salinas in California to where they do all the farming, and met a bunch of the owners of the farm, and had them sort of tell me about why they thought commercial farming was great or why they thought organic farming was great, and I was just really interested in that. So around that time, everybody was talking about colony collapse disorder, or the disappearance of colonies of bees. And the items in the news were always they had no idea what was happening. Bees were just disappearing, or entire colonies of bees were just disappearing, and it was just very mysterious at the time. So I think this was the first bee pile I made, and I called it Found 'em, and it's a pile of dead bees, and it was kind of tongue in cheek, but I went on to make, this is a print edition, so this is a silk screen. There's 38 of them, printed by Richard Duardo at Modern Multiples. In this, I'm a little bit more hopeful. They're not dead in this one, but still just kind of curious, wondering, what happened to all those bees and what's going on, and learning that it's actually the commercial bees that are disappearing and not necessarily the wild ones. So the piece that's in the show here, this is the original context I made it for. It was through a program called Folk Art Everywhere through the Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles. And they commissioned me to make an artwork that would be displayed in a non-museum setting. So I was assigned this grocery market in Highland Park, which is where my studio was at the time. And so I made this piece for this project. And I really like how it came out in the end, because you can see all the piles of produce in the back, and I like how they're all categorized and piled neatly. And here's a picture of me back then. This was about 10 years ago. I think that's all I have to say about that. If you want to follow my current work, this is my Instagram, and I always I always show what I'm making currently. So that's it.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm excited to introduce Scherezade García, who uses she, her pronouns. She is a painter, printmaker, and installation artist whose work often explores allegories of history, migration, collective and ancestral memory, and cultural colonization and politics. A co-founder of Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica, she holds an AAS from the Altos de Chabón School of Design, a BFA from the Parsons School of Design and the New School, and an MFA from the City College of New York, CUNY. Garcia's works have been featured in solo and duo exhibitions around the globe, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptures Grant and the Colleen Brown Art Prize. An edited monograph on her work was published in 2020 by the Art Museum of the Americas. She is a member of the Artist Advisory Council of Arts Connection and sits on the board of directors of the College Art Association and the Board of Women, and their are currently based in Austin, Texas, and New York. Please join me in welcoming Scherezade García.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's an honor. And every time I come here, I have such a good experience. So it's my second visit. This place is fabulous. Let's see. Okay, my presentation, I want to concentrate. I'm going to navigate basically between the personal and the collective. And the reason I'm going to do that is because this collective, the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfico, it was really something very important. And it was also what you're going to see. And I encourage you to go take a look at the show, because then that everything I'm going to say is going to make sense. This is the group. What I love about the group was that we were completely different. We all came from different not fields, but we were like in different stages of our career. We had different experience, and it was just so different. But we have one thing in common: we all artists. We all came from the Dominican Republic, and we had the experience of being in New York. And then somehow we decided that was an important moment for like to get united, and that was an important concept. And also, we decided that it was, we had to find a medium to work that unite us as well, and it was printmaking. And many of the artists over here were master printmakers, and many of them were people that use printmaking in their work, but not like constantly. So it was a way to kind of like mix all that. For example, some of the people that you see here, you're gonna see. You can see me. There is Alex that is on top, and he comes from a printmaking background from the Eastern Europe. He's Dominican, then he went to Eastern Europe to study, so he came with all these different traditions. Then we have people like Pepe Coronado, one of the co-founders, and Pepe over there. He actually became involved in printmaking because Sam Coronado, a very beloved, the late Sam Coronado in Austin, Texas. And then with that, he became very involved with the Chicano movement. And then is Rider Ureña, who, like me, also was involved in printmaking since he was very young in the Dominican Republic. My sister, who is over there, next to Luanda, is in the right, that also had that experience, but also coming from a graphic design background. And then Luanda, who is in the center, who basically Luanda is one of those master printers that is like every time you ask what Luanda is doing, he's in Japan, learning a new technique. So there was all, and I can tell you, each one of us, Moses Rose, who came with also a very New York-based kind of printmaking practice, completely different. But we were all inspired too by the idea of like working together. And we I started getting very involved with the studios of the Chicano when we went to Los Angeles. And then we also met many Puerto Ricans, Mexicans in New York, because you have to admit, New York is such a melting pot. And then all that, made this collective. So it was a collective that was very mixed, but it was all about this mixed, fluid identity. That's why we call Dominican Yorks. We a little bit Dominican, a little York, and also a bit Chicano, because the experience that we were, being inspired by. I basically made sure there was a description of what happened with the collective. We were 12, 3 women. Many of the artists, almost 9 of them, we came to New York. We arrived in New York because we were part of an affiliation with Parsons School of Design in Dominican Republic. And then the others were, like I said before, came from different places, but we all have very different practices. And then this is my work, and I'm going to explain how I usually work. My work is embedded in history and memory as well. And for me, even the process of doing the work, when I talk about inclusive, when I talk about mixed race, I don't only talk about it. I also like to make sure the process tells that, and because that, the work has many layers. Many times you see a painting of mine and it has a collage. It's a collage that is mine and also on top of the fabric, but it's always full of layers. And with that tradition in my work, I also use different kind of techniques in one print. In the case of this piece, that is the one that is at the show, came from this one. I talk a lot about contemplation. I talk a lot about how composition can really lead a narrative. Since 1996, I've been using these figures in my work that are always cinnamon. I always say cinnamon color because it sounds good. And basically, the idea is that I have so many colors in my skin that I cannot choose a flag. You know, I am European, Native American, African, you know, oh my God, the planet. So then how can I be exclusive? So I decided that an inclusive way of thinking would be if I mix all the colors in a palette, and that itself is the action of inclusivity, the outcome is going to be brown, cinnamon. So then I said, well, from 1996 on, all my figures are inclusive. So nobody's out. Everything is inclusive. But then talking about the concept of dreaming and the concept of movement, and when I think about movement and mixing, I think about migration, you know? So then to make sure I am grounded, I put that figure like as a foundation. It's grounded, it's rooted. He understands land, but it's always kind of traveling because he's dreaming. But dreaming, and especially in contemplation, provokes action because you're dreaming and you want those dreams to come to become a reality. So that was the beginning of that, and that piece is 30 inches by 22, and it's collage, printmaking with linoleum cut and acrylic and charcoal. And then this one here, just also following that tradition of like layers, I use the, first I did archival inkjet, and then I using the width of Manhattan, and it is evoking the fact that I come from an island and I go to another island. And that itself, it makes me belong to two things. And then I use the face with silk screen. The silk screen is a silk screen over here with the face, using the idea of the rooted face. And then the little paper boats are full of dreams of like tall buildings. Then you know, have a bombardment of a little playful banana airplanes. But the most important part is when I own my island, this time in the East Coast and North, planting a banana tree in the middle of Central Park. So it's once again this idea of belonging to many, to be plural. Let's see what there's. Then here are photos that I souvenirs of the experience of being in the collective. The majority of time we decided to meet at the studio of Riedel Ureña. Riedel Ureña had this enormous loft in Washington Heights. Washington Heights is like a little Dominican Republic. If you don't speak Spanish, you're in trouble. But it's actually a place where actually there are like people from everywhere, really. And we used to get together, and you can see there is such a harmony. It's such a mess, but it's the most beautiful, and it felt like such a wonderful, at that moment it was so wonderful to work us together. Because if you can see, there is Alex over there, and there is Miguel Luciano over there, and they both came, like I said before, we all came with different backgrounds. It was just like, you know, giving feedback, working together. It was really a wonderful honeymoon of working together. And this is Moses Rose, and in this case also with Alex Guerrero, and they were trying to decide in what kind of technique would really serve the work of Moses. And that was another thing that was super important in this collective. That everybody came with different traditions. And we were kind of everybody getting richer because those information and those getting together to work together. It was like everybody was like adopting new things. And that fluidity is then really made this experience wonderful. And it goes with the idea of printmaking that is so democratic. Because the fact of printmaking where you can do one image of many, and even when the repetition is really one of a kind, but it's still that idea of communal, you know? And it's funny how this very old telephone is on top of that. I have no idea why, but you can see that the problem was in that corner. And this is another moment when we bought a little printer, a little press, and we were trying to see the pressure we need to put on to make sure it was printing as it was. And one of the things I love the most is like some of the master printers like Luanda and Pepe, you know, we were like, oh, that looks fantastic. And it's not perfect. And it was great because it was like when we came, in my case, more fine arts, and they are like more playmakers, and it's like, no, that's not how it is. But was part of the learning, it was part of the communal, and it was part of like that wonderful collective. The best part of it. Here, this is my sister. When the situation with my sister was that she wanted to make the ink that she wanted to use was reflective. So that was another, kind of investigation, where to find out how to print it. So it was use silk screen and another technique to make sure we got what she wanted. So that whole investigation of technique, it was part of the entire group was into it. So we all learned. So she's like, that was a great experience. And then I'm gonna go to the personal. Even though you guys heard a little bit about the work, one of the work that I that was like 2010 really, at the same time that I was doing the collective. I baptized the ocean, the liquid highway. Because I am always trying to find, anything that will unite us. And because I come from an island, and I went to another island, I am always surrounded by water. And every time I see the back and forth of the wave, I think about what this wave is leaving, what is taking. But one thing I am sure is embedded in history, is embedded in tales, embedded in things that we don't know, but we can invent, and we can imagine too. So I always say that the waters, the water carry our DNA. So that was, and also that movement also informs that idea of migration, like the crossing of the Atlantic, who we are, and the outcome of that crossing, what happens. So then I started using printmaking as something that like I said before, the way that I do the process of the work has to be layers, because I talk about inclusivity and I talk about mixing, so it has to be cohesive with the concept, the outcome has to be, everything has to be in conversation. I also use the ocean, the water, the liquid highway is a very important part always in my work. So I do a lot of pieces that are inner tubes and things that float. Why? Because, like I said, surrounded by water, I was thinking about that the ocean, the sea, is an obstacle, but it's a via. So then so many of my work is with things that can be inflated. So instead of using linoleum cut, I go to those car shops where they have the tires. And I start finding things that I can carve in, like the rubber. So what I did was that I got these rubbers and I was able to cut like Chinese scrolls. And the idea of the Chinese scrolls comes with the idea that it's a never-ending story. We all belong to it, to this movement. And then I put them together. I carve the ocean, because that is story that unites us. And then I invited the public to basically own a little bit of the ocean and take a little piece of the sea with themselves as a souvenir. So I am tackling the collective with the piece, but I am also tackling the individual by everybody being able to ink it, press it, and then come out with their own print, and also they can choose the area. And then, this is, oh, sorry, I did it too fast. So this is the outcome of many of the prints together. So this is how I believe, that I can play and move forward the idea of the traditional printmaking, is by mixing everything that I got, and then coming with those core values that I feel really represent that democracy and that community that is really all about the action of printmaking. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to introduce our panel moderator this evening, Dr. Mary Coffey, who uses she, her pronouns, is a Dartmouth professor in the Department of Art History and affiliate faculty in Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies. She specializes in the history of modern Mexican visual culture with an emphasis on Mexican muralism and the politics of exhibition. And she also publishes in the fields of American art, Latin American cultural studies, and museum studies. She has published 2 books. The first, How a Revolutionary Art Became Official Culture, Murals, Museums, and the Mexican State. And her more recent book, Orozco's American Epic, Myth, History, and the Melancholy of Race. Notably, Dr. Coffey is also teaching a course this term called Print the Revolution. And I think many students here are in that course. So I would like to invite Dr. Coffey and our panelists back up front for discussion and Q&A.
Oh, good. Thanks, Beatrice. I want to extend my thanks to the Hood Museum and to the curators and artists that are here, the curator and artists who are here, for allowing us to have this exhibition, creating this exhibition, contributing to this exhibition, and bringing it to this campus where it has already lived a really vital life, integrated into, I think, more courses than most exhibitions, and I think we're breaking attendance records with it, which is just an indication of how important this subject is and how hungry people are for this kind of exhibition. My job is largely to field questions from the audience and to sort of dish them to the appropriate panelists. I think Michael has also asked for me to say a little something about the class, which is I rarely have the opportunity to spend an entire term in an exhibition. It's really been a treat. We come to the museum all the time. We work with the collection all the time. But to try to build a class around an exhibition is often impossible because of the timing of how we make our schedules and when the exhibitions come, and that kind of planning doesn't always work the way we want it to, but it did in this case. And my students have spent 2 weeks in the exhibition, just in the galleries every day, where the students generate talking points based on things they've read and works that they're drawn to, and then we sit in front of those works and we talk about them as a group, using the questions and the provocations that they've provided. They've all done visual analyses of works within the exhibition, doing really, really close readings of individual works, and really thinking about technique, thinking about scale, thinking about the particular print technique that's being used, and then of course thinking about context, the artist's concerns, and the sort of messaging of the image. So it was really rich, and those were really, really wonderful. I have to say, I wish I could share them with all of you. One of the things I want to say that I enjoy about the exhibition, and that I hope people in the audience have a chance to see it if they haven't, is that it isn't organized chronologically. It's organized thematically, and we see these legacies and also the connections and the transnationalism and the multi-ethnicity of what we think of as the original or sort of early Chicanx or Chicano, Chicana art movement simultaneously, rather than building a kind of false idea of a pure origin that kind of builds out into something more diverse. So we see the diversity from the get-go. And we also see, for example, the Dominican York portfolio exhibited early in the exhibition rather than being treated as a kind of a later phenomenon. And that allows us to sort of think about the internationalism and the many communities that were contributing to the original artists. And then, of course, we've really enjoyed the digital turn. And it's hard for me, I'm sort of curious to hear more about at what point in the planning of the exhibition you guys started thinking about those later works, and especially those sort of digital works, because they really are, in many cases, the works in the show that are really resonating with most of our experience of the show, because a lot of us saw the show digitally in the first instance, and we were experiencing the programming within the context of what was going on, what you were talking about. And so the pandemic, a lot of the artists talking about what it meant to have a collective practice within the context of that kind of isolation. How we had to pivot to digital connectivity, and also the importance of the digital domain for disseminating the kind of political concerns of those years, that in particular. So I'll stop now. I'll allow the panelists to speak to that if they want, but I also want to encourage everyone in the audience that has a question to raise their hands, and we have people who will bring a microphone to you so that everyone can hear the question. John. Director.
I know. Is it okay if I ask a question? Thanks. Dr. Zapata, you said something that I found really enticing. You said we need part two. And it might be premature, but I was wondering if you could give us a clue what that might look like, because that's a fantastic idea.
Sure. It's working now. Okay. There's that lag. Yeah, unfortunately, Chicano art shows and Latinx art shows have to do so much when they're offered the opportunity. You should be grateful this is even happening kind of experience that happens institutionally. If there's a program of this budget and you're expected to create and speak to this large span of time. And so really this kind of subject matter should be kind of broken up. And when you're afforded these opportunities, I always refer to them as eclipse shows. They happen every 10 years. And you get a catalog sometimes, and most of the time you don't. And I bring up a part two really because the amount of political activity and revolutionary imagery, and especially digital content creation, happened during the development of the exhibition. And so already, if you're talking about political graphics and a revolution is happening, then you need to acknowledge the amount of artistic production that's happening. And that's why I bring up a part two, because you need to acknowledge the amount of imagery. The whole idea of figuration in the COVID era, now representing people with masks, and the normalcy of representing a group of people and representing everyone that was affected, especially thinking about anti-Asian, and thinking about all that imagery that was coming because of Asian violence, thinking about Black Lives Matter, even though that's been going on for several years, but it really getting its push in 2020, and the amount of imagery that came up in terms of just acknowledging trans women's deaths, thinking about these death toll images, and a lot of that was happening digitally. And I think this show has allowed that to be okay to reference in thinking about a graphic show. That's why the title of the exhibition uses the term graphics, because it can encompass digitally based graphics. So we're not just thinking about works on paper or prints. And that was a huge confusion for everybody at the beginning. But I think now, because of the digital turn as a result of work from home and pandemic, that's now offered a whole new subject arena for thinking about digital-based work and thinking about generative art, thinking about this whole other chapter of what Latinx and Chicanx art actually looks like. And yes, it is protest imagery, but it also is this whole new arena of thinking about the digital sphere. So part 2 will have a big portion that is largely digital.
We've got a question right here. I'll just give you. Because this show is traveling and has multiple venues and will, roll out, right? Because it's going to Nashville next. Yes? No? Yes. I'm curious if the language around the show evolves. If you've revisited object labels or revisited wall text, as thinking has evolved, as the show goes on, or if you kind of develop the material for the first venue and then let that kind of follow through.
Sure. This is like a performance art piece. Okay, there's a contractual obligation of adhering to the original content mainly. And so each institution can review the labels, but then there are minor adjustments. So nothing really to think about it in a 2020 lens would involve retooling the entire show. And so there are really things you're missing out as a result because the zeitgeist is different, but so much is already advanced in terms of thinking about Latinx identity, Chicanx identity, that luckily we already were ahead before, and so now I think the larger general public has kind of caught up a little. And so again, if you're doing anything Chicanx, Latinx, you're always thinking in these multiple temporalities where you're kind of thinking about the past and thinking about artists who have been overlooked, doing basic identity information that is needed, like titles, attributing artwork, years, medium. Basic information is missing from collections, or these are just some things that have never had to be done because these works were never acquired, so they didn't go through that rigorous protocol of being introduced into a museum collection and needing all that data. So you're always thinking about that. You're thinking of the current moment, artists working in the current markets and thinking about what's being produced now, and then also thinking about the future and the next generation. So you're never just thinking in this one frame of time. You're always thinking about the elders who are still very present, who are still working and influencing younger generations and so on. And so it's always very challenging when you're developing any type of programming because you're speaking, again, as I said, to people coming at it from very different points of entry in terms of the knowledge and the just cultural literacy you're thinking about. And now thinking about post-2020 ideologies of visitors, I think they're just more receptive to the content. And so that's really the initial engagement. And again, the show made after 2020 would have different language here and there.
Any other questions? Someone from my class?
Here.
Hi. So the last time I was in this auditorium was a lecture, I believe, about sort of expanding the canon of American art, and what is American art. And I'm so curious as to both of you, the artist, do you consider yourself an American artist or Chicano artist or an artist? And is that label is it something we should shed, American artist? So I'm just curious as to how you see yourself and how we should speak about your art.
Okay. Well, I definitely identify as an artist. I've never thought about myself as being an American artist. What I do know is that labels can feel so restricting to me. I definitely believe that Chicano art is my heritage and it's part of my language, my visual language, but for me, calling myself a Chicana doesn't feel right, particularly because partially because of I have multicultural cultures. I have multiple cultures in my own family, and I think, but I also think that like all Chicanos or Chicanx in Los Angeles feel awkward because it's like you're at the border of Mexico and the United States, and there's just always this like, do I belong here? Do I belong there? I don't belong here. I don't belong there. So I feel like that awkwardness is actually part of the culture, and so therefore I am a Chicana. It's just very confusing. I spend hours and hours and hours agonizing over this. I really do, and it's such a waste of time. So, I mean, but on the other side of things, being part of the Chicanx or Latinx community is community building, and that is something that is good about labels. I asked my dad how he identifies, and because a lot of times people call him a Mexican-American artist, but our family is actually from New Mexico. My grandparents came from Santa Fe to Los Angeles. And he said that his parents identified as American, but they always called them Spanish to be polite. So again, are these labels helpful or not? Sometimes it seems like they're not.
Can you hear me? Yes. Oh my God. So anyways, it's complicated. I'm gonna tell you why. I do feel that I am an artist and I belong to everywhere, you know? And in fact, the title of a book about my work, it is Scherezade García from this side of the Atlantic. So I do love this side of the Atlantic. But I also come from the other side too, you know? But because I come from the Dominican Republic, you know, when we think about American art, we don't see it like from the United States. We see it from Alaska to Chile to the Caribbean. So then, American art? Of course I am American art because I come from the first city in this continent, you know? So those labels are complex. You know, and sometimes what I feel is that I feel trapped. I feel like the blazer is too small. Then it's like, do I feel that I am appropriating things that I don't belong to? It is complicated. So I will say that I feel more comfortable with being an artist, you know, and then we can talk about the little, you know, characteristics. But yeah, that's very difficult.
Right here. Oh, there's one back there, and then the green sweater is next.
We can hear you. Okay, sounds good. My question would be, I'm in the class right now, and I have to make a print. I have to make a poster, and I guess I'm very nervous about exhibiting it and also just like putting my name on it, mostly because of my identities. So has there ever been a time when you have felt very hesitant about being open about your identity and your story because of safety reasons and like political concerns, mostly when we talked about the last 4 years or so or more?
Hello? Yes? Okay. Yes and no. I guess I realize some things can be provoking after. You know, like, then I am like, wow, you know, I was brave. But I see that like 10 years after. You know? But sometimes we feel intimidated, but I think you should go for it. Just put your name, your print. You know? I think. That's how I see it. Go for it.
I've definitely struggled with feeling nervous about putting political content out there. My parents weren't really actually that political in terms of the way they raised me. Actually, my dad has made political artwork, but it was, I feel like, more accidental in some ways. But I do struggle with feeling awkward about having white privilege in comparison to some of my brown artist friends in terms of the content I put out there. So that's definitely something that I worry about.
There was a question here in the green sweater. I think. There we go. Thank you, Doyen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this event. So cool to hear how the whole thing got put together and how it got here and the troubles with the COVID and stuff. And I think the funnest thing is to hear how the artists, like, to learn. I didn't even see that was a face at the bottom, and it's so obvious in the picture. And for you to talk about it and give us all the history and stuff, that's the coolest. And to see the skulls and then to the other stuff, it's just so wonderful to see how it all comes about. And then to see that in its actual spot with the so, sorry. Did you attach the bees together? They're all attached, or are they all loose? So that changes
They're
when
loose. Yeah. They're actually all loose, and then I guess somebody has to come and place them.
Right. That's what it looked like, but I
From the
wasn't sure.
Smithsonian.
Oh, yeah, there's a registrar that has to follow the work, and there was emails about the height, the platform. We had to take a photo. Sonia had to approve its placement. So we had to count the bees. We had to create the height for the bees. Is this mound right for the bees? I'm going to say bees one more time. And so each time it travels, our Smithsonian representative has to come and approve the bees and the
I
mound.
should have just sewn them together.
I think so, but I think each time it creates its own little performance. Yes. And thinking about the three-dimensionality of printmaking, she was part of this chapter within the exhibition of thinking about works not on paper, but that are part of the printmaking process, and thinking about works that existed in public interventions, thinking about outside of the gallery space. Obviously, she showed the image of it being in a grocery store, and that was part of the allure when we were developing the show, is thinking about these spaces for printmakers who don't have the necessarily like overt clenched fist, UFW eagle, the usual iconography associated with what one defines as Chicano graphics, but equally as political when you're thinking about environmental concerns and you're thinking about community interaction with artwork. All of these are still political acts, and to make sure those types of artists like Sonia don't get overlooked because they don't have the same exact kind of protocol of what mainstream institutions have attributed to what Chicano art needs to look like.
And if I could just, what you showed, sorry, Sonia, you showed the zebra work that you were working on now with, so like, is that, what are you, for the two artists, what are you guys excited about, like, what you're doing right now? What's, you know?
Well, after working in the public art field for so long, I'm just getting back to my studio practice. The last time I was really working in my studio practice was when I was making these pile works. And then I just spent like years and years working on these commissions with, which has allowed me to learn how to work with communities that I would never go into otherwise, and bring in viewpoints other than my own into artwork. The one with the zebra, it's very specific to Northeast LA, but maybe you've seen it in other cities as well. But when you see a horizontal fence like this, it means that the house is being flipped for a profit and that someone was probably displaced. And so the background to the zebra, on the fence, there's actually like a graffiti that was like painted out that said gentrifier, and that was from an actual incident that happened in El Sereno. that I was referring to. It's very specific to LA, but that's just a small work painting I recently finished like last week, so I just threw it up there. The zebra is from the Los Angeles Zoo. I took my kids there and I said, that zebra looks like a lino cut, so I'm gonna make a lino cut of that zebra. And sometimes art, sometimes art can just be that. It doesn't always have to have a political context, but I guess since I'm Chicana, I have to put a political context. I thought of something I wanted to say. Something that I really like about Chicanx graphics is how the visual language is so legible. We so often use pictures that people can recognize and read, and I like how accessible that is, and I use that all the time when I'm designing public art, because people who consume public art don't necessarily visit museums or have any understanding about art context. So I love that about Chicano art, and I continue to use that, and I just wanted to say that.
What I'm doing right now, hello, yes. What I am doing right now is I've been painting a lot for the last 5 years. I always do installation, performances, I always a mix of things, which is very in tune with what I was talking about, like mixing of things. But my paintings now are large, but many of them have a base that is print, like kind of what you saw that, but this time is on canvas, big, which is a go back to something I did in 2003, but completely different. Big paintings like that. Also, I have a new experience now. I am teaching in Austin, Texas, and the landscape and the Chicano everything, is definitely, I am more in love with that kind, because I love that. I love people. And those cultural encounters completely enrich me. So I can see how the landscape, it is coming afloat in my work, and which I kind of love. And I also going back to the Caribbean to do some projects that are with my floaties, and it has to do with water, because that's very much in my work. Thank you.
Will? I think Jada.
Hello?
There's someone up there. Okay, two
am
Wills.
I good to,
Go
am I
ahead,
good to
Will.
go? Okay, cool. So hi, I think it's really cool that the two artists that we have here, and you guys have both sort of already brought this up already, but Scherezade, you're from New York, and Sonia, you're from LA, which are both these huge cultural hubs that aren't really specific to any one identity, and they're on opposite sides of the country, right? So I was sort of wondering if you could both talk a little bit about how the city that you're from has influenced your work, and the place that you've come from, and sort of the scene there. And yeah, I don't know. That's sort of connected to something we're learning about in class too, but yeah.
I didn't quite hear what you said. Did you talk about the city I'm from and just what's that? An art hub, yeah. Yeah, LA is an art hub. It's so multicultural. The way that it is, though, is so odd, because you kind of get trapped inside your city within the city, because everybody drives everywhere, but if you do get in your car, it's going to take you 2 hours. So nobody goes anywhere. So you kind of get trapped in these little spheres. I mean, not everybody does, but I tend to stay in Northeast Los Angeles, for instance, or East Los Angeles. And if to go to the West Side is horrifying. But if you're brave and you do go outside of your block, you fall into another complete culture. It's so divided up. It's such an odd place to live. And so like I was sort of talking about before, having that Chicano label being sometimes constricting. We do live in such a multicultural city. Maybe we could collaborate more, and sometimes I think I should just do a series of portraits of people that are not Chicano and see what people think, and it would be this act of rebellion for me. I mean, I'm really contemplating doing that. because, like, why not? We live in Los Angeles, you know, it's multicultural. I don't know, that's it.
We have so many things in common, huh? Okay. But you know, a funny story. Okay, when I was in college, you know, when I decided to go to this, you know, United States kind of like college that is Parsons, you know, it was a completely change. I was going to Spain, and I was like going to Spain, you know. I know I can't read all the codes over there, but when I went to New York, it was a shock. It was like, wow, this is utopian. You know, it was like every block, in every block was, in fact, it was the hardest thing was to learn English, because everybody had an accent like I do, still, and everybody spoke another language. You know, all my classmates at Parsons were like from Japan, Korea, India, you know, and wow, you know, and that definitely inspired me. To this day, I am somebody that I don't have frontiers. I don't believe in that, because I do feel inspired, and I feel like completely involved, and I feel that I belong when I am with this mix of things, you know? Because I feel that, you know what, also I am being selfish here. I know it's always gonna be a source of inspiration. So I know it's material for me, I think as an artist. You know, so I do think the East Coast, New York specifically, you know, it has been very important to me. But if I think about the East Coast, I also think about Florida, which is completely a different experience. You know, and now that I go to Southwest, I am like, oh my God, this is still more complex. You know, now I am very much into Comanches and Apaches, you know, trying to defend everything that has to do with that, you know, but also understanding the history, how complex it is. So yeah, I do feel that it has influenced me a lot, and it has made me more global and tolerant.
Hi there. Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate just hearing everything you've had to say. My question is pretty simple. In terms of putting this piece or this exhibit together, and having worked with so many different just kind of pieces of art, how would you define Latinx art now? Just because there's been so many controversies, and this, I know this exhibit, we read about how this sparked a lot of controversy, and like, was there a point to this? So I think for me, just, I would love to hear your perspectives as artists and as a curator.
I'm waiting for the lag. Okay, there it is. Yeah, well, it's interesting, that always comes up in terms of definitions, and it's very challenging when you're thinking about the application of a definition for an exhibition, because the art objects are really what you're working with, and you're thinking about the institution that's hosting the exhibition as well, and the mission behind that institution. So Smithsonian American Art Museum, you're really pushing this idea of American. And as Scherezade said, really when we're thinking about Smithsonian American Art Museum in the Washington, D.C. context, it really is the U.S., not America. America is a hemispheric approach. And only within the last about probably 10, 15 years, in terms of among scholars, has there been this question about Latinx, and really now Latina, thinking about the gender inclusivity of these terms of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, Latino, Latina, Latinx. All of this has come up in terms of regional specificity, because the East Coast is definitely not privy to Chicano history, unfortunately, so that came up. And thinking about Latino, that came a little bit easier for our constituents and colleagues of understanding what that was, but that still was a point of confusion, because there's this misunderstanding of really the branding of a lot of these identities, of thinking about, there's a book called Inventing Hispanic, and thinking about the Hispanic branding that happened in the 80s, and really the disruption of civil rights movement projects and the Chicano movement, and this disruption and just this sort of
unfortunately, the push for mestizaje to really think of this broad term. And it's very interesting when Latinx comes up because there's this interpretation of that definition as being white-centric. And I always liked looking at the messages and comments on social media because about the show, every time the institution would post about the exhibition, because you saw that immediate discourse from the public. And it was, Latinx is not a thing, or Chicanx is not a thing, or Chicanos no longer. Everybody had their stake in the game. And Latinx, it's really interesting because the scholars are pushing that so much in terms of the names of research centers, the names of curatorial positions, the names of professor positions, and they're really pushing the X. And now the younger generation is really pushing Latine with an E, and to be more inclusive of thinking about Spanish language dominant speakers, and the idea of the X not being very fluid when you're speaking. And once you're adding this Spanish dominant language and thinking about that term, you're really thinking about a hemispheric conversation. And then that becomes more Latin American. And then that also becomes very confusing for everybody because they're like, wait, weren't we trying to get away from that? And they're like, yes, but kind of, but not really. And so it's always an interesting conversation, especially with the youth, because I think any Latina, Latinx, as long as we're acknowledging non-binary and trans members of communities, we're already doing something very well. But there's such a backlash to that, obviously, because the state of the country and internationally of acknowledging, people's existence and their identities, unfortunately, that's just always gonna come up. And having these very long conversations, like just the sentences I just said, that's very hard to translate into a press release. And we've had to, in our press release for the show, there had to be a definition of what Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, and how we were using it. And I remember Carmen Ramos, the curator, contested that because she said, we don't have to define what American is. We don't have to define what Black is. Why do we have to define what Chicano is? And there's this back and forth about that amongst curators, professors, of why do we have to explain that? And that was just something we eventually had to compromise in. If you ever go into the museum field, you will realize how many stakeholders there are in these large projects, and unfortunately you don't have that breadth of lines and character accounts that an article may have. You have very short labels, very short press releases, you have blurbs. And to talk about something so all-encompassing as Latinx, Chicanx, it's very challenging because you're using all these very loaded terms that have histories in white supremacy, and each generation is vouching for it in a different way, because it's interesting when the Chicanos, they're like, I'm not Latinx. Not from the anti-trans point, some of them, yes, but some of them are like, I'm not Latinx because Latino is white European. Like it's very broad. Like Chicano is a political identity I earned and I had to become, and it was part of this radical act. So doing this Latino umbrella, I'm not into that. And then Latinx, people are, yes, it's pro-trans, pro-non-binary, let's move for that. So it's very challenging to think about what that looks like, because when you're defining a definition of, when you're doing a definition for an art movement that's been longer than 50 years, it can encompass everything. And especially when we're thinking about Chicano, that's really the 50 years that I'm using. And for Latino, you have to think about the history of that terminology and how it's used to define the Americas and its proximity to white European kind of ethnic identities, and who's using it and how. So the context is very fun. And it's just it's an interesting terrain we are in terms of that conversation that it's come up. But the more it comes up, the more eyes are on the artists, and that to me is the most significant part of this. Like, as long as you're talking about the artists, we'll figure it out. We don't need a definition that's going to last. The idea is that it's an open source definition, that it can be modified per the communal engagement. We're using like computer science language, it is an open source concept. Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, X in the front, for example, X in the back, to reference nominal, and then you're like, whoa, where are we? What are we doing? There's so many options.
I'm afraid that I think we are out of time because I think we probably are just getting going, but I also know that people in the audience have other things they have to do, and I know that our guests are also have been working hard all day. So thank you so much. And thank you again to the three of you.